Imagine, if you will, absolute nothingness, not merely darkness, for darkness implies the absence of light, and light had not yet been conceived. Not silence for silence suggests the absence of sound, and sound required space that did not exist. What we contemplate here transcends human experience entirely, a void so complete that void itself lacks meaning. No molecules danced, no energy pulsed, no time passed because time had nowhere to flow. This was not the vacuum of space. Space itself awaited birth. This was not the quiet before the storms required atmosphere, matter, and dimension. This was the great unbeginning, where even the concept of beginning held no purchase. And then, in a moment that would echo across eternity, reality erupted into existence. Consider the magnitude of this instant. From absolute nothing came everything, not gradually, not through slow accumulation, but in a single, magnificent decree. "Let there be light," spoke a voice that had no need of Kree-yi. Vocal cords, no requirement for sound waves, no dependency on air to carry meaning. Pure will became pure energy, and pure energy blazed forth as light. This was no ordinary illumination. No star burned, no flame flickered, no electrical discharge sparked. This light preceded all sources of light. It was light itself, the fundamental force that would later reveal color, beauty, and truth to conscious eyes. Picture it, not the gentle dawn you witness from your window, but the birth of illumination as a concept, light dividing itself from darkness with surgical precision. The Creator looked upon this first work and called it good. In Hebrew, the word carries weight beyond our simple good. It suggests perfection of purpose, beauty of function, rightness of existence. Light was not merely adequate, it was exactly what reality required to begin its cosmic symphony. But this was only the first movement in a 6-day opus that would establish the stage for all future dramas. As the second day dawned, and we must marvel that day itself now had meaning, waters divided, waters above, waters below, with space stretched between them like a vast canvas awaiting an artist's touch. Archaeologists working in ancient Mesopotamia have discovered creation accounts from surrounding cultures, and they make for fascinating comparison. The Babylonians imagined gods battling monstrous forces, creation emerging from cosmic warfare. The Egyptians pictured their deities shaping reality through magical arts. But Genesis presents something revolutionary: creation through speech, order emerging from the Creator's word alone. Beauty birthed not through conflict but through purposeful design. On the third day, dry land gathered itself from the primordial seas, not slowly, as geological processes might suggest, but in obedience to divine command. Immediately, and this detail captivates the imagination, the earth sprouted with vegetation, grass, herbs yielding seed after their kind, fruit trees bearing fruit whose seed was in itself after its kind. Notice the precision. From the very beginning, life carried within itself the blueprint for continuity, reproduction programmed into each species with elegant specificity. The fourth day brings an astronomical puzzle that has intrigued scholars for millennia. If light already existed, why wait until now to create the sun, moon, and stars? The answer reveals something profound about the nature of reality. These celestial bodies serve not as sources of light, but as timekeepers for the ages to come. The sun to rule the day, the moon to govern night, the stars as markers for seasons, days, and years. Consider the implications. Time itself gained structure, rhythm, predictability. Agriculture became possible when humans could anticipate seasons. Navigation became feasible when stars marked positions. Calendar systems could emerge when celestial movements created reliable patterns. The universe had become not merely illuminated but organized for the convenience of creatures yet to be created. The fifth day witnessed an explosion of life that paleontologists still struggle to comprehend. Waters teemed with living creatures, whales breaching in primordial oceans, fish schooling in waters that had never known predation, creatures great and small filling ecological niches with stunning variety. Above, birds took flight on wings that knew instinctively how to catch thermals, how to navigate vast distances, how to construct nests with architectural precision no engineer had taught them. Each creature emerged fully formed, equipped with the behaviors necessary for survival, reproduction, and flourishing. The complexity astounds. Consider the migration patterns of Arctic terns, flying from Arctic to Antarctic annually, the echolocation abilities of dolphins, processing sound with sophistication that rivals military sonar, the magnetic field sensitivity of sea turtles, navigating thousands of miles, return to their natal beaches. But the sixth day held the masterpiece. Land animals appeared first, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth after their kind. Lions possessed of majesty, gazelles gifted with grace, elephants equipped with intelligence that still surprises researchers. Each species arrived with instincts perfectly calibrated to their environment, behaviors that spoke of intentional design rather than random development. And then came the crown moment of creation. "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness," the Creator declared, using plural language that has puzzled theologians for centuries. Not as an afterthought, not as another species among many, but as the culminating work of cosmic architecture. Here begins the greatest experiment in the known universe. Beings created in the divine image, gifted with choice, creativity, and the capacity for love. The Hebrew word Adamah means ground, earth, dust. From this humble material, the Creator formed Adam not through gradual evolution, not through random molecular assembly, but through divine craftsmanship, shaping clay with the same hands that had positioned stars. But clay alone cannot think, dream, worship, or create. So the Creator breathed into Adam's nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Contemplate this moment, the infinite breathing into the finite, the eternal imparting life to the temporal. Adam's first sensation was not pain but presence awareness of himself, his environment, his Creator. His first sight was not darkness but the garden prepared for his habitation. His first experience was not struggle but purpose, as he received dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and every living thing that moved upon the earth. This dominion was no license for exploitation, but a calling to stewardship. Adam would name the animals not arbitrarily, but in recognition of their true nature, their essence captured in language. This required intimate study, careful observation, deep understanding. The first human vocation was science, learning, categorizing, appreciating the created order. Archaeological evidence continues to illuminate the world of Genesis. Excavations in Mesopotamia reveal sophisticated civilizations existing precisely where Scripture places humanity's early development. Linguistic studies trace language families back to common origins, suggesting the scattering described at Babel. Genetic research points to population bottlenecks consistent with Noah's flood. Cultural anthropology finds creation stories among isolated peoples worldwide, all bearing striking similarities to Genesis, despite having no contact with Hebrew traditions. Yet Genesis stands unique among ancient texts for its insistence that creation emerged not from divine conflict, but from divine order, not through magic but through word, not accidentally but purposefully. Its revolutionary claim that humans bear God's image undermines every form of oppression, declaring each person infinitely valuable regardless of race, status, or ability. As that first Sabbath dawned the seventh day, when the Creator rested from his work creation hummed with potential, every system functioned perfectly, Every creature thrived in its intended habitat. Every natural law operated with mathematical precision. The universe had become not merely functional but beautiful, not merely complex but elegant, not merely vast but somehow intimately scaled for the conscious beings who would explore its wonders. The stage was set, paradise prepared. The greatest love story in cosmic history was about to begin, along with the greatest tragedy, the greatest rescue, and the greatest hope. For this perfect creation would not long remain perfect. Choice, that divine gift that made love possible, would also make possible the unthinkable. But that story awaits our next discovery together, as we venture into a garden where 4 rivers flowed from a single source, where every tree was pleasant to sight and good for food except one. A garden where the first man and woman would face a choice that would echo through every human heart that followed. What began in perfect light was about to encounter its first shadow. What emerged from divine order was about to experience its first disruption. What started as paradise was about to discover what paradise lost might mean, and why paradise lost would make paradise regained so precious. The light had conquered darkness, but could it conquer what came next? Eden bloomed as creation's masterpiece, a garden where perfection took tangible form. Picture, if you will, a landscape where every element existed in flawless harmony, where the very word garden fails to capture the magnitude of what God had planted eastward in Eden. 4 rivers flowed from a single source, their waters crystal clear and life-giving, watering lands rich with gold that gleamed without tarnish, aromatic resin that perfumed the air with heaven's own fragrance, and precious stones that caught light and scattered rainbows with every gleam. This was no ordinary oasis, but a realm where the physical and spiritual worlds intersected, where earth touched heaven and heaven blessed earth. In this perfect ecosystem, Adam exercised dominion not through force but through understanding. Each morning brought new discoveries as he studied the creatures that surrounded him, observing the intricate dance of honeybees, learning the communication patterns of dolphins, marveling at the architectural genius of beavers. His task was to capture each creature's essence in a name, and this required intimate knowledge, patient observation, profound comprehension of their nature. Consider the sophistication this demanded. Modern zoologists spend lifetimes studying single species, yet Adam possessed the mental capacity and spiritual insight to understand the true character of every living thing. When he named the eagle, that name encompassed not merely its physical appearance, but its soaring spirit, its keen vision, its mastery of wind and sky. When he named the lamb, he captured its gentle nature, its innocence, its vulnerability that would later make it the perfect symbol for sacrifice. The tree of life stood at Eden's heart, its fruit capable of sustaining immortality. Here was creation's most generous gift, eternal existence available for the taking, life without end offered freely to beings made in God's image. Its leaves never withered, its fruit never spoiled, its roots drew from waters that would never run dry. But nearby grew another tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, bearing fruit that looked remarkably similar, yet carried consequences that would shake the foundations of creation. God's command regarding this tree was clear, precise, unmistakable. Of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. Notice the generosity embedded in this prohibition. Of every tree hundreds, perhaps thousands of varieties you may freely eat. Only one tree stood forbidden, and that prohibition came with clear explanation of consequences. This was not arbitrary restriction, but loving protection, not divine jealousy, but paternal wisdom. When Eve arrived, formed from Adam's own bone and flesh, something new entered creation's vocabulary: completion. This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, Adam exclaimed with joy that resonates across millennia. Here was his counterpart, his equal, his perfect complement. Where he possessed strength, she brought wisdom. Where he showed logic, she demonstrated intuition. Together they represented humanity whole, image-bearers, complete. The first marriage united two halves of humanity in naked innocence. Shame did not exist because sin had not yet corrupted their perception. They stood before each other and before God without fear, without self-consciousness, without the desperate need to hide that would soon consume their descendants. Their love was pure because their hearts were pure. Their communion was perfect because no barrier separated them from each other or from their Creator. Archaeological discoveries in Mesopotamia reveal that ancient peoples understood the significance of gardens as sacred spaces. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon attempted to recreate paradise through human effort. Persian paradises, the very word paradise, comes from their language, represented earthly attempts to mirror heavenly perfection. Yet all such gardens required constant maintenance, irrigation, protection from weeds and pests. Eden needed none of these interventions. It was self-sustaining, eternally beautiful, perpetually fruitful. But paradise contained a serpent. More cunning than any beast of the field, this creature possessed intelligence that exceeded its apparent nature. Whether it spoke naturally or through supernatural influence, its words carried persuasive power that would echo through human history. When it approached Eve, it came not with obvious temptation, but with subtle questioning, planting doubt through seemingly innocent inquiry. Has God indeed said, "You shall not eat of every tree of the garden"? Notice the craftsmanship of this first temptation. The serpent did not directly contradict God's command, but questioned its clarity, suggesting perhaps Eve had misunderstood. Perhaps the prohibition was not as absolute as it seemed. This strategy, making people doubt the clarity of divine communication, would become humanity's recurring stumbling block. Eve's response revealed both her knowledge of God's command and a subtle addition that may have indicated the seed of doubt already taking root. We may eat the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, "You shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die." God had forbidden eating but not touching. Did this addition represent overprotective caution, or the beginning of resentment against divine restriction? The serpent's next words shattered the foundation of trust upon which paradise rested. "You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Here was the first recorded lie in human history, and it contained three devastating elements. First, direct contradiction of God's warning, "You will not surely die." Second, accusation of divine deception, "God knows," suggests God had hidden the truth. Third, promise of enhanced existence, "You will be like God." The temptation unfolded in three stages, each appealing to a different aspect of human nature. The fruit was good for food, it appealed to physical appetite, the body's desire for nourishment and pleasure. It was pleasant to the eyes, it attracted aesthetic sensibilities, the soul's hunger for beauty and delight. It was desirable to make one wise, it promised intellectual advancement, the spirit's yearning for knowledge and understanding. When Eve's teeth pierced the fruit's skin, more than juice flowed out. Innocence bled away like life from a mortal wound, replaced instantly by knowledge too terrible to bear. The fruit delivered exactly what the serpent promised. Knowledge of good and evil, but that knowledge came at a price no human heart could afford to pay. The cascade failure began immediately. Eyes opened as promised, but the first thing they saw was their own nakedness, their own vulnerability, their own desperate need for covering. Hearts that had known only love now experienced shame. Minds that had dwelt in truth now harbored deception. Spirits that had communed freely with God now cringed in terror at his approach. When Adam tasted the forbidden fruit, for Scripture makes clear he was with Eve during the temptation, choosing to participate rather than protect the last barrier between humanity and corruption crumbled. Paradise died with that first bite, not because God withdrew his presence, but because sin made his presence unbearable to guilty consciences. The sound of God walking in the garden in the cool of the day had once brought joy beyond description. Now it sent the first couple scrambling for hiding places among the trees, fashioning coverings from fig leaves, desperately attempting to conceal their shame behind vegetation that God himself had created. "Where are you?" God called, not because he could not locate them, but because they needed to acknowledge their condition, their choice, their new reality. This question echoes through every human heart. Where are you in relation to your Creator? Where are you in your spiritual journey? Where are you hiding from the truth about yourself? Adam's response revealed how quickly sin corrupts character. A woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I ate. Notice the blame shifting first toward Eve, then subtly toward God himself. The woman whom you gave suggests that God bore responsibility for Adam's choice. The perfect unity between husband and wife shattered into accusation and self-protection. Eve, in turn, blamed the serpent. The serpent deceived me, and I ate. True enough, but incomplete. She had possessed the knowledge to resist, the wisdom to choose correctly, the freedom to obey. Deception explained her vulnerability, but did not excuse her responsibility. God's judgment fell with precise justice, each consequence fitting the nature of each rebellion. To the serpent came the curse of crawling in dust, eating earth all the days of its life, with the promise that Eve's offspring would ultimately triumph over the forces of deception and evil. To the woman came multiplied sorrow in childbearing, pain in the very process that would perpetuate the human race, and tension in the marriage relationship that had been perfect unity. The creation of life would now involve suffering. The partnership of marriage would now require struggle. To the man came futile labor as the ground turned hostile, bringing forth thorns and thistles, requiring sweat and toil to produce food that had once grown effortlessly. The earth that had been his ally became his opponent. The work that had been joy became burden. The dominion that had been easy became exhausting. Yet even in judgment, mercy appeared like dawn after the darkest night. God himself made clothing from animal skins, performing history's first sacrifice to cover human shame. Blood was shed, innocent life, given to protect guilty ones. Death entered creation not as mere consequence, but as provision, animal life offered to preserve human life, sacrifice establishing the pattern that would ultimately provide complete redemption. The theological implications stagger the mind. The same God whose justice demanded punishment provided the means to bear that punishment. The same Creator whose holiness could not tolerate sin made provision for sinners to approach him. Love and justice met in that first sacrifice, establishing principles that would govern divine redemption throughout history. As the couple prepared to leave Eden, expelled not in anger, but in mercy, for to eat from the tree of life in their fallen condition, he would trap them eternally. In corruption, an angel with a flaming sword took position to guard the way back. This was not cruel prevention, but loving protection, ensuring that fallen humanity could not become immortal in their broken state. The garden remained, perfect and pure, awaiting the day when paradise would be regained, when the last Adam would succeed where the first Adam failed, when the tree of life would again become accessible to redeemed humanity. The river that watered Eden would flow again. The fruit that sustained immortality would again nourish those made righteous. The presence of God would again be joy rather than terror. But between paradise lost and paradise regained lay a long story of human struggle, divine patience, and ultimate redemption. The first couple walked out of Eden carrying within their hearts both the memory of perfection and the hope of restoration. They had learned the bitter knowledge of good and evil, but they had also received the first promise of victory over the forces that had deceived them. The garden gates closed behind them, but the story had only begun. What started with light conquering darkness and ended with paradise lost would continue with humanity's search for the way back home, guided by the same God who had walked with them in Eden's perfect peace. The serpent had won the first battle, but the war was far from over. Violence filled the earth like a plague spreading unchecked through humanity's bloodstream. What began with one forbidden bite had metastasized into corruption, so complete that every imagination of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. Picture this moral wasteland. Murder had become commonplace. Justice had become mockery. Love had become exploitation. And the image of God in humanity had been so defaced as to be nearly unrecognizable. In this landscape of spiritual devastation, one man found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah, whose name means rest or comfort, shone like a lone star in absolute darkness, a righteous man, perfect in his generations, who walked with God as his great-great-great-great-grandfather Enoch had walked before him. The corruption surrounding Noah defies modern comprehension. Genesis tells us that all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth, suggesting not merely moral failure but systematic perversion of every natural order. Violence filled the earth, not occasional crime but endemic brutality, not isolated incidents but cultural norm. The Hebrew word Hamas, used here, encompasses not merely physical violence but injustice, oppression, and the complete breakdown of civilized society. Consider the patience of God during this period. Traditional chronology suggests that while Noah constructed the ark, his voice served as herald of coming judgment for 120 years. 120 years of warning, 120 years of opportunity for repentance, 120 years of grace extended to a civilization that had forfeited every claim to mercy. When God's instructions arrived, they came with shipbuilder's precision that speaks to divine engineering expertise. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and outside with pitch, and this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Translating ancient measurements into modern terms, God commissioned a vessel 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. To grasp the magnitude, imagine a ship longer than a football field, wider than a 6-lane highway, taller than a 4-story building. This was no recreational boat but a massive cargo vessel designed for unprecedented catastrophe. The construction materials reflect both practicality and symbolism. Gopher wood, possibly cypress, renowned for water resistance, provided the framework. Pitch sealed every joint, making the vessel watertight. The Hebrew word for cover is kafar, the same word used for atonement, suggesting that this coating not only protected from water but symbolically covered from judgment. 3 decks with rooms throughout provided compartmentalized storage and living spaces. Modern naval architects, marveling at these specifications, note that the ark's proportions, approximately 6:1 length to width, provide optimal stability in rough seas. This was no primitive raft but sophisticated marine engineering that would ride out the most violent storm in Earth's history. As Noah built, following blueprints for a vessel larger than anything floating in his world, neighbors must have gathered to witness this spectacular exercise in apparent madness. Picture their reactions: an enormous ship taking shape miles from the nearest substantial body of water, constructed by a man claiming God had warned of worldwide flood. The mockery would have been relentless, the ridicule constant, the social pressure to abandon this folly overwhelming. Yet Noah persevered, perhaps finding encouragement in the increasing violence around him, perhaps strengthened by communion with the God who had shared his heart and plans. Day after day, year after year, the ark grew larger while the world grew darker. Beam by beam, plank by plank, Noah built humanity's only refuge from approaching catastrophe. The passenger manifest defied comprehension. Of every clean beast you shall take 7 pairs, male and female. Of beasts that are unclean 2 pairs, male and female. Also 7 pairs of every bird of the air, male and female, to keep the species alive on the face of all the earth. Consider the logistics. If modern estimates of animal species prove accurate, Noah housed representatives of approximately 16,000 species, 32,000 individual animals, plus provisions for feeding them during an unknown duration at sea. The Ark's volume of approximately 1.4 million cubic feet could accommodate this manifest, but the organizational challenge staggers the imagination. Food storage alone demanded massive preparation. Carnivores required meat, herbivores needed vegetation, and humans needed sustenance for potentially more than a year. Fresh water storage for drinking, cooking, and cleaning multiplied the supply requirements. Waste management for thousands of animals in enclosed spaces required systems that maintained sanitation while preserving limited fresh water supplies. When the appointed day arrived, something remarkable occurred that Genesis describes with understated elegance. So they went into the ark to Noah, 2 by 2 of all flesh, in which is the breath of life. The animals came voluntarily, migrating toward the ark in orderly procession, as if responding to an inaudible summons that only they could hear. Picture this unprecedented parade: elephants trumpeting their approach, lions padding silently alongside lambs, eagles soaring overhead while penguins waddled below, butterflies fluttering near bears shambling towards safety. Every instinct that normally governed animal behavior, territorial aggression, predator-prey relationships, migration patterns temporarily suspended as creation responded to its creator's call. When the last animal entered and God himself shut the door, sealing 8 human souls and thousands of creatures inside their wooden refuge, the heavens opened and the earth convulsed. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. The language suggests catastrophe beyond normal meteorological phenomena. Fountains of the great deep implies massive geological upheaval, perhaps volcanic eruptions, tectonic shifts, underground reservoirs bursting forth with unimaginable force. Windows of heaven suggests not mere rain, but the release of waters stored above the firmament since creation's 2nd day. For 40 days and nights, rain fell in sheets so dense that breathing became difficult. But this was merely the beginning. Waters continued rising for 150 days total, covering all the high hills under the whole heaven by 15 cubits, approximately 22 feet above the highest mountains. Imagine the earth's transformation. Valleys disappeared first, then hills, then mountains, vanishing beneath an ocean that covered the globe from pole to pole. Every air-breathing creature outside the ark perished not gradually through flood-related diseases or food shortages, but through drowning in waters that offered no refuge, no escape, no hope of survival. Inside the ark, Noah's family tended their floating zoo while waters covered the earth. The vessel that had seemed impossibly large during construction now felt cramped as home to humanity's future. Daily routines of feeding, cleaning, and caring for thousands of animals provided structure during months of uncertainty. The sounds must have been overwhelming: roaring, chattering, squeaking, trumpeting, a cacophony of life preserved while life outside the ark ceased forever. Archaeological evidence supports the possibility of massive flooding in antiquity. Core samples from the Black Sea reveal evidence of catastrophic inundation around 5,500 years ago when Mediterranean waters burst through the Bosporus, raising sea levels by hundreds of feet in a geological instant. Mesopotamian flood deposits suggest periodic inundations that traumatized ancient memory. Geological studies of the channeled scablands in Washington state demonstrate how enormous volumes of water can reshape landscapes in days rather than millennia. When glacial dams burst during the last ice age, floods carrying 10 times the combined flow of all current rivers carved canyons and moved boulders weighing thousands of tons across hundreds of miles. But Genesis describes something beyond regional catastrophe, a global deluge that reset creation's clock, cleansing the earth of corruption through judgment by water. The Hebrew word mabul, used for this flood, appears nowhere else in Scripture, except in references to Noah's experience, suggesting a unique event without parallel in human history. For 5 months, the ark rode upon waters that covered the earth while God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him in the ark. The phrase, God remembered, does not suggest divine forgetfulness overcome, but rather covenant faithfulness activated. At the appointed time, God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters began to recede. As slowly as they had risen, the waters retreated. Mountain peaks emerged like islands from a vanished world. The ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat, not necessarily the specific peak bearing that name today, but somewhere in the mountainous region between the Black and Caspian Seas, where multiple ancient traditions place humanity's fresh beginning. Noah released a raven that flew back and forth over the waters, finding no place to rest. 7 days later, he sent out a dove that returned exhausted, having found no dry ground. Another 7 days passed before the dove brought back an olive leaf plucked fresh, clear evidence that vegetation had begun to recover from the flood's devastation. When the dove failed to return from its 3rd mission, Noah knew the earth was ready for reoccupation. After a full solar year in the ark, 377 days, by some calculations, God commanded the family to emerge and release every living creature to repopulate the barren world. Noah's first act on dry land speaks volumes about his character. Before building shelter, before planting crops, before attending to human needs, he constructed an altar and offered burnt offerings to the Lord. The smoke of sacrifice rose from a cleansed earth as thanksgiving for deliverance and dedication for the future. Remarkably, Scripture says this sacrifice smelled sweet to God, a fragrance of obedience, gratitude, and worship that somehow pleased the divine heart enough to inspire an everlasting promise. Never again would God destroy the earth by flood, regardless of humanity's future rebellion. The rainbow appeared as the sign of this covenant, nature's promise written across the sky in bands of colored light. This covenant reveals both divine justice and divine mercy. Justice had been satisfied through judgment upon corruption. Mercy now provided stability for the future, ensuring that seasonal cycles would continue, that planting and harvest would remain reliable, that day and night would follow their appointed order, regardless of human behavior. Yet the flood accomplished more than mere destruction and preservation. It demonstrated that God takes moral corruption seriously enough to judge it decisively. It revealed that God provides salvation for those who trust Him, even when that salvation appears foolish to contemporary observers. It established the principle that divine judgment, though certain, is never arbitrary, always preceded by warning, always accompanied by provision for escape. As Noah and his family stepped into a washed world where every familiar landmark had vanished, where they alone survived from the previous age, they carried both tremendous responsibility and tremendous hope. The earth lay clean and empty, ready for civilization's second chance. Humanity had been reduced to 8 souls, yet those 8 souls carried within them the genetic diversity necessary to repopulate the globe. The animals spread across continents, adapting to new environments, diversifying into the species we observe today. The family multiplied, establishing settlements, developing technologies, preserving memories of the catastrophe that had reset human history. But would the lesson last? Would this new beginning produce the righteousness that had been lost? Would Noah's descendants remember the rainbow's promise and the flood's warning? The answer lay ahead, in a tower that would reach toward heaven and a scattering that would divide humanity across the globe, setting the stage for God's next great intervention in human history through a man named Abram, who would leave everything familiar to follow a divine call into the unknown. In Ur of the Chaldees, a city whose magnificent ziggurats pierced the Mesopotamian sky, like stone fingers reaching toward the moon they worshipped, lived a man whose life was about to become the foundation of faith for billions yet unborn. Archaeologists first confirmed Ur's existence in 1922, when Sir Leonard Woolley's excavations revealed a civilization of stunning sophistication, royal tombs containing golden harps, intricate mosaics, and evidence of mathematical and astronomical knowledge that rivaled later Greek achievements. This was no backward settlement, but a cosmopolitan center where merchants from distant lands traded precious goods, where priests studied celestial movements to divine the will of gods, where artisans crafted jewelry and artifacts that still dazzle museum visitors today. In this place of comfort, culture, and religious certainty, Abram heard a voice that would change not merely his life, but the trajectory of human spiritual development. Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. Consider the magnitude of this divine invitation. At 75 years old, when most men seek the security of familiar surroundings and the comfort of established routines, Abram received a call to abandon everything that defined his identity. Country, the political and cultural context that shaped his worldview. Family, the social network that provided security and meaning. Father's house, the economic foundation that ensured prosperity and status. In return, God offered only a promise, a land that I will show you. Not a detailed map, not a guaranteed destination, not even a timeline for arrival. Simply the word of a God who had revealed himself to Abram in ways Scripture does not fully explain, but which were compelling enough to motivate the most radical life change imaginable. The caravan that left Ur represented more than one man's faith journey. Abram took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all the souls they had acquired in Haran, likely servants who had become followers of the true God through Abram's influence. This was not merely immigration, but the birth of a spiritual movement, the beginning of a people defined not by geography or ethnicity, but by shared faith in the God who calls people out of comfort into covenant. The journey northward to Haran covered approximately 600 miles through territory controlled by various tribal groups, some friendly to travelers, others hostile to merchant caravans carrying valuable goods. Ancient trade routes connected these cities, but travel remained dangerous bandits, wild animals, disease, and the constant challenge of finding water and provisions for large groups moving slowly across semi-arid terrain. In Haran, Abram's father Terah died, severing the last family tie that might have pulled the patriarch back toward familiar territory. When the call came to continue southward, into Canaan, Abram faced the test that would define his character. Would he trust God's promise enough to leave even this intermediate refuge for the complete unknown? The caravan that departed Haran and turned south toward Canaan carried the hope of human redemption, though Abram could not have grasped the cosmic significance of his obedience. Each step through the desert brought him farther from security and deeper into dependence upon divine provision. Each day's journey represented an act of faith renewed, trust sustained despite uncertainty about the destination. When they finally reached Canaan, Abram discovered a land already occupied by Canaanite tribes, whose religious practices included child sacrifice, temple prostitution, and other abominations that would later justify their displacement. Yet God appeared to Abram at Shechem and declared, "To your descendants I will give this land." Standing among people who currently possessed the land, Abram built an altar to commemorate God's promise, his first recorded act of worship in the Promised Land. From Shechem, Abram moved to a mountain east of Bethel, where he built another altar and called upon the name of the Lord. These altars served multiple purposes. They marked significant locations where God had revealed himself. They provided places for sacrificial worship that maintained communion between heaven and earth, and they served as silent testimony to the Canaanites that a new player had entered their territory. The pattern of Abram's life emerges in these early chapters. Movement, revelation, worship, promise. God continued revealing himself progressively. Abram responded with altar building and sacrifice, and the promises grew more specific with each divine encounter. This rhythm of divine initiative and human response would characterize not only Abram's experience but the entire history of God's people. When famine struck Canaan, Abram faced his first major test since leaving Haran. Would he trust God to provide in the Promised Land, or would he seek security in his own resources? The decision to descend into Egypt revealed both human weakness and divine grace. Though Abram's deception about Sarai's identity demonstrated moral failure, God protected his chosen vessel even through disobedience, sending plagues upon Pharaoh's house until the truth emerged, and the couple was expelled from Egypt with their wealth increased. Returning to Canaan, rich in livestock, silver and gold, Abram discovered that prosperity sometimes creates problems that poverty never poses. The flocks and herds of Abram and Lot had multiplied to the point where the land could not support both households. Conflict arose between their herdsmen, threatening to destroy family unity and provide scandal for watching Canaanites. Abram's response revealed the character that had prompted God's initial call. Though he possessed the right of seniority and could have demanded first choice of territory, he generously offered Lot the opportunity to select his preferred region. "If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if you go to the right hand, then I will go to the left." Lot's choice seemed logical from human perspective. The Jordan Plain was well watered, fertile, and already settled with cities that provided markets for agricultural products. Scripture notes that it was like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go towards Zoar. But Lot's preference for cities over countryside, for immediate advantage over long-term consequences, would prove costly beyond his ability to imagine. Abram settled in the mountains of Canaan, content with less attractive territory because he trusted God's promise that all the land would eventually belong to his descendants. His choice of apparent disadvantage positioned him for divine blessing, while Lot's choice of apparent advantage led him toward disaster. The test of war came when an alliance of 4 kings conquered the cities of the Jordan Plain, taking captives including Lot and his family. News reached Abram through a survivor who recognized him as Lot's kinsman. The wealthy herdsman suddenly became a military commander, arming 318 trained men born in his house and pursuing the victorious armies northward to Dan. The night attack that freed the captives and defeated multiple armies demonstrates both Abram's tactical genius and God's supernatural intervention. A force of 318 men should not have prevailed against professional armies, yet Abram routed his enemies so thoroughly that he recovered not only his nephew, but all the people and goods taken from the conquered cities. The encounter with Melchizedek after this victory provides one of Scripture's most mysterious episodes. This king of Salem, who was also priest of God Most High, appeared suddenly, offering bread and wine to Abram and pronouncing blessing upon both the patriarch and the God who had delivered his enemies into his hand. Abram's response, giving Melchizedek 1/10 of all the spoils, established the principle of tithing and recognized this mysterious figure's spiritual authority. Archaeological evidence from this period confirms the political instability Genesis describes. Excavations throughout the Near East reveal destruction layers dating to approximately 2100 to 2000 BCE, supporting the biblical account of coalitions conquering established city-states. Ancient texts from Mari, Nuzi, and other sites illuminate customs that make Genesis narratives suddenly comprehensible, explaining why childless couples adopted servants as heirs, why blessing ceremonies held such legal force, why certain contracts were sealed by walking between animal pieces. Years passed, with Abram growing richer but remaining childless. The promise of descendants seemed increasingly impossible as Sarai aged beyond normal childbearing years. When God appeared, again, confirming his commitment to make Abram's offspring as numerous as the stars, the patriarch asked the question that echoes through every believer's heart: Lord God, how shall I know that I will inherit it? God's response involved a covenant ceremony of stunning solemnity. Abram was instructed to bring specific animals: a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon, and cut them in half, arranging the pieces to create a path between the severed carcasses. In ancient Near Eastern culture, this ritual meant that the covenant maker was calling down upon himself the fate of these animals if he failed to keep his word. As darkness fell, Abram watched in terror as a smoking firepot and blazing torch, visible symbols of God's presence, passed between the pieces. God himself walked through death to guarantee his promise, voluntarily placing himself under obligation to fulfill every word he had spoken. This was not merely divine commitment, but divine vulnerability, the Creator binding himself by oath to his creation. The covenant's specific terms included prophecy of 400 years in a land not theirs, where Abram's descendants would serve and suffer before returning to possess Canaan when the iniquity of the Amorites is complete. This prediction accurately described Israel's experience in Egypt and their subsequent conquest of Canaan under Joshua, events still centuries in the future when God spoke them to Abram. At 99 years old, when hope had nearly died and Sarai remained barren, God appeared again with new names and new promises. Abram became Abraham, father of many nations, while Sarai became Sarah, princess. The covenant sign of circumcision was instituted, marking every male in Abraham's household as belonging to the God who had called them out of Ur. When 3 visitors appeared at Abraham's tent during the heat of the day, Sarah laughed at their prediction that she would bear a son within a year. At 90 years old, the biological impossibility of pregnancy struck her as absurd. Yet her laughter would be transformed when Isaac arrived, his name meaning laughter. Living proof that God's promises transcend natural limitations. The ultimate test came when God requested the sacrifice of this miracle child. Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Abraham rose early, split wood for the offering, and began a 3-day journey that must have felt like walking toward the execution of hope itself. Every step toward Moriah carried him farther from natural reason and deeper into trust that defied human understanding. When Isaac asked about the sacrificial lamb, Abraham's response revealed faith refined by decades of divine faithfulness. God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. On Mount Moriah, Abraham built an altar, arranged the wood, bound his son, and raised the knife above the child, who represented every promise God had made. In that moment of ultimate testing, when natural affection and spiritual obedience seemed to war against each other, Abraham chose trust in God's character over confidence in his own understanding. Heaven's intervention came precisely when human resources reached their limit. Do not lay your hand on the lad, or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. A ram appeared caught in the thorns, becoming the substitute sacrifice that spared Isaac's life. Abraham named that place Jehovah-Jireh, the Lord will provide, commemorating not only that day's provision, but establishing confidence in God's faithful supply for every future need. Archaeological evidence suggests this mountain later became the site of Solomon's temple, where substitutionary sacrifice continued for centuries until the ultimate substitute arrived to provide complete redemption. The testing was complete, and Abraham had passed every examination. He had left comfort for uncertainty, wealth for wandering, family for faithfulness to God. He had believed God's promise when circumstances made it seem impossible, trusted God's character when commands seemed contradictory, maintained hope when hope appeared foolish. Yet Abraham's story represents more than individual spiritual development. Through this one man's faith journey, God established the pattern of redemption that would culminate in Christ. The call out of worldly security, the journey of faith through desert places, the covenant sealed in blood, the sacrifice of a beloved Son, the divine provision of a substitute, all these elements would find their ultimate fulfillment in the gospel story. Abraham died at 175. Having seen the beginning of God's promise but not its completion, he possessed only a burial cave in the promised land, yet Scripture records that he died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. His legacy lived not in real estate acquired, but in faith demonstrated, not in wealth accumulated, but in trust established between heaven and earth. The promise continued through Isaac, who inherited both his father's faith and his father's God. But the greatest inheritance Abraham left was not land or livestock, but the assurance that God keeps his word, regardless of how impossible his promises appear to human reason. From Ur to Moriah, from 75 to 175, Abraham's journey mapped the geography of faith for everyone who would follow in his footsteps. He had walked with God through decades of testing and found that divine faithfulness never failed, divine provision never lacked, divine love never wavered. The God who called Abraham out of Ur was the same God who provided the ram on Moriah. And that God was still calling people to trust him beyond what their eyes could see, their minds could grasp, or their circumstances could support. The journey of faith had begun with one man's obedience, but it would continue through his descendants until faith itself found its perfect object in the one who would come as both the ultimate Abraham and the ultimate Isaac, the faithful one who would also be the provided sacrifice. Jacob's favoritism blazed like fire in the fabric of Joseph's coat of many colors, a garment that transformed the 17-year-old dreamer into a walking reminder of his brother's inferior status in their father's affections. Every thread in that magnificent robe proclaimed what the 10 older sons already knew and resented. Joseph was loved beyond measure, cherished beyond reason, preferred beyond justice. The Hebrew text suggests this was no simple multicolored garment, but a tunic reaching to the palms and soles, a full-length robe indicating nobility, leisure, freedom from manual labor. While his brothers rose before dawn to tend flocks in wilderness pastures, their hands growing rough with shepherding work, their backs bent with physical toil, Joseph remained near his father, clothed in splendor that marked him as destined for leadership rather than labor. Archaeological discoveries from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia reveal that such garments carried profound social significance. Royal tombs contain similar robes adorned with gold thread and precious stones, worn by pharaohs and princes to distinguish their elevated status. For a young man barely past childhood to possess such clothing suggested not merely paternal indulgence, but preparation for inheritance, training for authority, expectations of future greatness. When Joseph shared his dreams, that simmering resentment ignited into murderous rage. The first dream was agricultural. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright. And indeed your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. The imagery was unmistakable. Crops bowing suggested dominion over food supply, authority over sustenance, power over survival itself. The second dream escalated the offense. Look, I have dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. Even Jacob rebuked Joseph for this vision, recognizing that sun and moon represented parents while 11 stars symbolized brothers. The dream predicted not merely economic authority but familial supremacy, cosmic recognition of Joseph's destined leadership. Consider the explosive psychology at work. 10 men who had labored for years building the family's wealth, who had risked their lives protecting flocks from wild animals and bandits, who had earned calluses and scars in service to their father's interests, heard their teenage brother predict their future submission to his authority. The coat of many colors became a banner of their humiliation, the dreams a proclamation of their irrelevance. When opportunity arose far from their father's oversight, jealousy finally erupted into violence. The brothers saw Joseph approaching their pastures in Dothan and immediately conspired against him. Look, this dreamer is coming. Come, therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit, and we shall say, some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams. Only Reuben's intervention prevented immediate murder, though his motives mixed family loyalty with self-interest as the eldest. He bore responsibility for Joseph's safety and hoped to return the boy safely to avoid Jacob's wrath. When the brothers stripped away the coat of many colors and threw Joseph into a waterless pit, they symbolically stripped away his favored status, casting him into the kind of harsh reality they had known all their lives. The arrival of Ishmaelite traders provided an alternative to murder that still accomplished their goal: permanent removal of Joseph from their lives. Judah's suggestion to sell rather than kill their brother was motivated more by profit than mercy. What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. 20 pieces of silver, the price of a teenage slave according to Leviticus 27 verse 5, became the value placed on the boy whose dreams had promised such different reputed future. The caravan that carried Joseph toward Egypt bore more than one young man torn from his family. It carried the future of God's covenant people, though none of the participants could possibly have grasped the cosmic significance of their transaction. The elaborate deception that followed reveals how deeply hatred had corrupted the brothers' consciences. They dipped the coat of many colors in goat's blood and presented it to Jacob as evidence of Joseph's death, allowing their father to draw his own tragic conclusions rather than lying directly. Jacob's response, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him." Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces, plunged the household into mourning that would last for years. Archaeological evidence confirms the thriving slave trade between Canaan and Egypt during this period. Egyptian tomb paintings depict Semitic peoples arriving as merchants and remaining as servants. Administrative records from the Middle Kingdom period list foreign slaves holding various positions from field laborers to household supervisors, confirming that capable foreigners could achieve significant status even in bondage. In Potiphar's house, Joseph experienced the first test of character that would define his Egyptian years. Rising from slave to supervisor demonstrated not merely administrative competence, but spiritual integrity that impressed even pagan masters. The Hebrew text emphasizes that the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, suggesting that divine blessing made his excellence visible to human observers. When Potiphar's wife attempted seduction, Joseph faced a choice between immediate pleasure and long-term character. His refusal was grounded in both practical wisdom and spiritual conviction. "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife." How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Notice the progression of Joseph's reasoning. Respect for his master's trust, recognition of his privileged position, acknowledgement of marriage boundaries, and ultimately awareness that sin is fundamentally offense against God. When continued, refusal provoked her anger. Joseph chose flight over compromise, leaving his garment in her grasping hands. The second coat lost to preserve integrity. Prison became Joseph's next proving ground, where divine favor again elevated him from prisoner to administrator. The keeper of the prison recognized the same excellence that had impressed Potiphar, committing all prisoners to Joseph's care and trusting his judgment completely. Even in confinement, Joseph's character created spheres of influence that prepared him for greater responsibility. The interpretation of dreams for Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker revealed spiritual gifts that transcended natural ability. When both men shared their nighttime visions, Joseph's responses demonstrated both supernatural insight and pastoral wisdom. To the cupbearer, he predicted restoration to royal favor within 3 days. To the baker, he sadly announced execution by the same timeline. The accuracy of these interpretations, exactly as Joseph had predicted, the cupbearer was restored while the baker was hanged, should have secured Joseph's release through grateful recommendation to Pharaoh. Instead, the cupbearer forgot his promise to mention Joseph's case, leaving the Hebrew prisoner to remain in confinement for 2 additional years, while God's timing slowly ripened. When Pharaoh dreamed of 7 fat cows devoured by 7 lean ones, followed by 7 healthy grain stalks consumed by 7 withered stalks, none of his wise men could provide satisfactory interpretation. Only then did the cupbearer remember the Hebrew prisoner who had accurately interpreted his dream years earlier. Joseph appeared before Pharaoh wearing prison garments, hastily shaved and cleaned but still bearing the marks of extended confinement. His interpretation of the dreams demonstrated both supernatural wisdom and practical administrative insight. 7 years of unprecedented abundance would be followed by 7 years of devastating famine, requiring immediate preparation to survive the coming catastrophe. More remarkably, Joseph proposed a detailed solution: appoint a wise, the administrator, to collect 20% of grain during the abundant years, building strategic reserves sufficient to supply Egypt and surrounding regions during the famine. This recommendation revealed economic understanding that anticipated modern principles of disaster preparedness and resource management. Pharaoh's response was immediate and dramatic. Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? The pagan ruler recognized divine wisdom when he encountered it, elevating Joseph from prisoner to prime minister in a single day. The signet ring, gold chain, and fine linen garments symbolized complete authority over Egypt's resources, while the royal chariot and herald proclaiming, "Bow the knee," announced Joseph's elevation to all classes of society. Egyptian records from this period confirm that Semitic administrators could achieve remarkable positions in the pharaonic hierarchy. The story of Sinuhe, an Egyptian official who fled to Canaan and later returned to royal favor, parallels elements of Joseph's experience. Administrative papyri reveal complex systems for grain storage and distribution that match the biblical account of Joseph's preparations. Geological studies of Nile sediment cores confirm cyclical flooding patterns that could produce exactly the feast-famine cycles Genesis describes. Volcanic activity affecting global weather patterns, solar radiation variations, and other natural phenomena create periodic disruptions in river flooding that translate directly into agricultural abundance or failure across entire regions. When famine struck as predicted, Joseph's preparations proved their worth. While surrounding nations faced starvation, Egypt became the granary of the ancient world, selling grain to desperate peoples throughout the Near East. The administrator, who had begun as a slave, now controlled the food supply that determined which nations would survive and which would perish. The arrival of Joseph's brothers seeking grain created the most emotionally complex scenario in Genesis. These men who had sold him into slavery now stood before his throne, bowing exactly as his boyhood dreams had predicted, begging for the sustenance that only he could provide. They did not recognize the powerful Egyptian official as their brother, but he recognized them immediately. Joseph's initial harsh treatment of his brothers was not revenge, but testing. He needed to determine whether 20 years had changed their character, whether they would abandon Benjamin as they had abandoned him, whether genuine repentance had replaced the jealousy that had nearly destroyed their family. The elaborate deception involving the silver cup hidden in Benjamin's sack brought the brothers to their moment of ultimate testing. When Joseph accused Benjamin of theft and threatened to keep him as a slave, Judah offered himself as substitute. The same Judah who had suggested selling Joseph now volunteered for slavery to protect Rachel's other son. This transformation in Judah's character broke Joseph's emotional control. Through tears that washed away 20 years of separation, he revealed his identity to the brothers who had betrayed him. "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now, do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." The theological sophistication of Joseph's response staggers the mind. He recognized divine sovereignty working through human sin, God's purposes accomplished through human betrayal, cosmic salvation achieved through family dysfunction. What his brothers intended for evil, God had intended for good, orchestrating events to position Joseph where he could save not only Egypt but the very family that had rejected him. The reconciliation culminated in Jacob's entire household, 70 souls migrating to Egypt's Goshen region, where fertile pastures provided ideal conditions for shepherding, while geographic separation preserved their distinct identity. Joseph's elevation from prisoner to prime minister enabled him to offer his family the best land in Egypt, ensuring their survival during the remaining years of famine. As Jacob's caravan approached the border of Egypt, they carried more than family belongings and flocks. They bore the covenant promises given to Abraham, the blessings passed through Isaac, the prophetic destiny that would make them a great nation. Joseph's rise to power had prepared not merely personal vindication but national preservation, ensuring that God's chosen people would survive to fulfill their cosmic purpose. The boy who had worn a coat of many colors now wore the fine linen of Egyptian authority. The dreamer who had shared visions of future greatness now lived those visions as present reality. The slave who had lost everything had gained everything: position, power, purpose, and most precious of all, the restoration of family. Relationships thought destroyed forever. But Joseph's story was more than individual triumph over adversity. It was divine preparation for the next chapter in redemptive history, when the family of 70 would become a nation of millions, when servants would become warriors, when slaves would become the people through whom God would reveal himself to all nations. The dreams had come true, but the greatest dreams were yet to be fulfilled. For 3,500 years, Genesis passed from generation to generation through meticulous copying, each scribe approaching his sacred task with reverence that bordered on fear. The Masoretic tradition required that every letter be counted, every word verified, every line compared against master texts with precision that would impress modern quality control specialists. If a single error was discovered in a manuscript, the entire scroll was buried with religious ceremony, and the copying process began anew. Picture these ancient scribes in tensure, their dim scriptoriums, bent over parchment scrolls by flickering oil lamps, reproducing letter by letter the words they believed had come from God himself. They understood that they were not merely copying literature, but preserving divine revelation, maintaining the connection between heaven and earth through faithful transmission of sacred text. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy named Muhammad Edi H. Dib threw a stone into a cave near Qumran while searching for a lost goat. The sound of pottery shattering echoed from the darkness. Curiosity overcame caution, and the young shepherd climbed down to investigate. Inside the cave lay clay jars containing what would become the most significant archaeological discovery of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among these ancient documents, scholars found Genesis texts dating to approximately 150 to 100 BCE, nearly 1,000 years older than any previously known Hebrew manuscripts. When linguistic experts compared these ancient copies with medieval Masoretic texts, they discovered variations so minimal as to astound even skeptical scholars. A few minor spelling differences, occasional synonym substitutions, but the substantial content remained virtually identical across a millennium of hand copying. Consider the implications. In an age before printing presses, photocopying, or digital storage, human scribes had preserved Genesis with accuracy that modern technology might envy. The reverence for sacred text that motivated such precision suggests these copyists believed they were handling something infinitely precious, not merely human literature, but divine communication, worthy of perfect preservation. Earlier, in 1872, a young Assyriologist named George Smith, working in the British Museum, made a discovery that electrified the scholarly world. While translating cuneiform tablets excavated from Nineveh, Smith encountered a passage that made him leap from his chair and rush around the room in excitement. The tablet contained an ancient Mesopotamian flood account with parallels to Genesis so striking that even secular scholars could not dismiss the connections. This was the Epic of Gilgamesh, and its flood narrative featured a righteous man warned by the gods, a great boat built to specific dimensions, animals saved in pairs, a catastrophic deluge destroying humanity, the vessel grounding on a mountain, birds sent out to test for dry land, and sacrifices offered upon emerging from the ark. The similarities to Noah's story were unmistakable, yet crucial differences revealed Genesis's unique theological perspective. In the Babylonian version, petty gods fighting among themselves decide to destroy humanity because their noise prevents divine sleep. One god warns Utnapishtim secretly, afraid to tell the others about his intervention. After the flood, the gods smell the sacrifice and gather like flies around the offering, quarreling about who was responsible for the catastrophe and promising never again to destroy humanity because they need human servants. Genesis presents a starkly different picture. One righteous God judges evil while providing salvation, divine justice balanced with divine mercy, moral corruption rather than divine irritation, motivating judgment, and covenant promises ensuring future stability. Where Mesopotamian accounts featured capricious gods motivated by selfish concerns, Genesis revealed a God of justice, mercy, and covenant faithfulness. In 1929, archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated Ur, uncovering a sophisticated city that precisely matched Genesis's description of Abraham's origin. The excavations revealed a cosmopolitan center with advanced mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, and international trade connections. Royal tombs contained golden harps, intricate mosaics, and evidence of complex religious ceremonies involving human sacrifice to accompany dead rulers into the afterlife. The wealth and culture Woolley uncovered explained why leaving Ur required such extraordinary faith. Abraham had not departed from primitive nomadism but abandoned sophisticated civilization, leaving behind libraries, schools, temples, and commercial networks that connected Mesopotamia with distant lands. His journey into the unknown represented genuine sacrifice of comfort, status, and security for nothing more substantial than divine promise. Subsequent archaeological discoveries continued illuminating Genesis narratives. The Nuzi tablets, discovered near modern Iraq, revealed ancient legal customs that made puzzling Genesis stories suddenly comprehensible. Why did barren wives give their servants to their husbands? Nuzi law required such arrangements to ensure inheritance. Why did blessing ceremonies carry such legal force? Because spoken words constituted binding legal contracts in ancient Near Eastern culture. Why did Rachel steal her father's household? Gods, when fleeing with Jacob? Because possession of these idols determined inheritance rights in certain legal traditions. Why could Jacob not simply take his wives and leave? Because marriage contracts required complex negotiations involving bride price, dowry, and ongoing family obligations that affected multiple generations. Each archaeological discovery provided another piece in the puzzle of ancient life, confirming that Genesis narratives reflected accurate knowledge of historical customs, legal practices, and cultural details that would have been unknown to later fiction writers, but perfectly familiar to contemporary observers. In 1987, molecular biologists studying mitochondrial DNA made discoveries that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. By analyzing genetic material passed exclusively through maternal lines, researchers traced all human mitochondrial DNA back to a single African woman living between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago. The media dubbed her Mitochondrial Eve, and subsequent studies confirmed that all currently living humans descended from this common maternal ancestor. Y chromosome studies yielded similar results, pointing to a single male ancestor from whom all modern human males descended. While the timelines suggested by molecular dating techniques differed significantly from traditional Genesis interpretation, the single-source origin of humanity resonated profoundly with biblical claims about Adam and Eve as the first parents of the entire human race. Genetic diversity studies revealed additional fascinating correlations. Despite superficial differences in appearance, all human races shared 99.9% identical DNA, confirming that racial variations represented minor adaptations to local environments rather than fundamental species differences. The biblical claim that all humans descended from common parents found scientific support in genetic evidence, that racial boundaries were essentially cosmetic. Population genetics also identified genetic bottlenecks in human history, periods when the total human population dropped to remarkably small numbers before expanding again. Some researchers suggested these bottlenecks might correspond to catastrophic events that decimated human populations, possibly including floods or other natural disasters recorded in ancient traditions worldwide. Geological evidence accumulated supporting massive flooding events that could have traumatized ancient memory. Exploration of the Black Sea revealed that approximately 5,500 years ago, Mediterranean waters burst through the Bosporus Strait with catastrophic force, raising Black Sea levels by hundreds of feet in what geologists now call the Black Sea Deluge. This event would have displaced thousands of people, scattered populations across vast distances, and seared flood stories into humanity's collective consciousness. Sediment cores from the Persian Gulf revealed similar evidence of massive flooding events in Mesopotamia during the period when Genesis places the flood narrative. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers showed evidence of extraordinary flooding episodes that covered vast areas, depositing layers of silt that remained visible in geological records millennia later. Comparative mythology studies revealed that flood stories appeared in cultures worldwide, not just in the Near East, where contact with Hebrew traditions might explain similarities, but among isolated peoples in Australia, South America, Asia, and Africa who had no known contact with biblical traditions. The universal presence of flood narratives suggested either common origin in historical memory or actual historical events that affected human populations globally. The study of ancient languages provided additional confirmation of Genesis accounts. Linguistic analysis traced major language families back to common origins, supporting the biblical account of humanity's division at the Tower of Babel. The distribution of language groups across continents matched patterns that would result from a single dispersal event, followed by isolation and independent development as populations spread across the globe. Archaeological investigations of ancient Mesopotamian cities revealed evidence of sudden abandonment and rebuilding that could correspond to the Babel narrative. Sites like Babylon showed evidence of massive construction projects involving tower-like structures that reached unprecedented heights for their periods, matching the biblical description of human pride, expressing itself through architectural achievement aimed at reaching heaven. Astronomical research contributed another layer of confirmation. Studies of ancient calendars, seasonal markers, and agricultural cycles revealed sophisticated knowledge of celestial movements that matched the Genesis account of stars, sun, and moon, serving as signs for seasons, days, and 2 years. Ancient monuments like Stonehenge demonstrated that early humans possessed advanced understanding of solar and lunar cycles, using astronomical knowledge for both practical and religious purposes. Anthropological studies of hunter-gatherer societies revealed behavioral patterns consistent with Genesis descriptions of early human culture. The transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture occurred simultaneously in multiple locations worldwide, approximately 10,000 years ago, matching the time frame suggested by some interpretations of biblical chronology for post-flood human development. Studies of ancient metallurgy confirm that humans developed complex technologies rapidly rather than gradually, supporting the biblical picture of advanced civilization emerging quickly after the flood. Archaeological evidence showed that metalworking, pottery, weaving, and other sophisticated crafts appeared suddenly in the archaeological record, rather than developing through slow evolutionary progression. Modern genetic studies of plant and animal domestication revealed that major food crops and livestock species were domesticated in remarkably short periods, often simultaneously in multiple locations. This pattern matched the Genesis account of rapid human expansion and technological development following Noah's flood, as scattered populations quickly established agricultural societies across the globe. Underwater archaeology provided additional evidence for ancient coastal civilizations that were submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. These discoveries suggested that highly developed societies existed in areas now underwater, supporting possibilities that advanced pre-flood civilizations might have left traces on the ocean floor rather than on dry land, accessible to traditional archaeological investigation. Climate studies revealed that the periods corresponding to Genesis narratives experienced significant environmental changes that would have profoundly affected human populations. Ice core data showed evidence of volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, and other catastrophic events that could have contributed to the environmental conditions Genesis describes during various periods of ancient history. The accumulation of archaeological, genetic, linguistic, geological, and astronomical evidence created a remarkable picture. While specific interpretational questions remained open to scholarly debate, the basic historical framework of Genesis found increasing support from multiple scientific disciplines. Rather than contradicting modern knowledge, Genesis appeared to preserve ancient memories of real events filtered through the theological perspective that recognized God's hand in human history. Each new discovery seemed to add another piece to an increasingly complex puzzle, suggesting that Genesis preserved not merely theological truth but historical memory of humanity's earliest experiences. The reverence with which ancient scribes preserved these texts appeared justified by their accuracy in describing the world that archaeology, genetics, and geology were slowly reconstructing. As 21st century science continued probing humanity's origins, researchers found themselves repeatedly returning to questions that Genesis had addressed millennia earlier. How did the universe begin? Where did humans originate? Why do all cultures share similar stories about floods and divine encounters? How did complex civilizations emerge so rapidly after periods of apparent devastation? The answers emerging from scientific investigation did not always match traditional interpretations of Genesis, but they consistently supported the text's claims about the fundamental unity of humanity, the reality of catastrophic events in human history, and the sophisticated knowledge preserved in ancient traditions. The stone that shattered pottery in a Qumran cave had initiated discoveries that would revolutionize understanding of both biblical preservation and ancient history. The Dead Sea Scrolls proved that Genesis had been transmitted with extraordinary accuracy across millennia, while archaeological discoveries confirmed its historical reliability in describing the ancient world. The sacred text that had guided Abraham out of Ur, sustained Joseph through Egyptian slavery, and promised Noah safety through global catastrophe, continued revealing its treasures to each generation of seekers willing to dig deeper into the foundations of human story. Genesis principles pulse through contemporary civilization like spiritual DNA, shaping law, ethics, science, and human rights in ways so fundamental that we rarely recognize their ancient origins. The revolutionary idea that humans bear God's image, declared in the first chapter of the first book of Scripture, has undermined every form of oppression throughout history, declaring each person infinitely valuable regardless of race, status, ability, or achievement. When the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, the opening words echoed Genesis. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. This was not secular innovation, but ancient wisdom, finding contemporary expression, the image of God concept translated into international law. The revolutionary claim that all people possess inherent worth simply by virtue of being human traced directly back to Genesis 1 verse 27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. Consider how this single verse has shaped human civilization. Before Genesis introduced the concept of universal human dignity, ancient societies routinely practiced slavery, infanticide, and the systematic oppression of those considered inferior by birth, ethnicity, or circumstance. The Egyptian, Babylonian, Greek, and Roman empires all built their kaya, economies on the assumption that some humans existed to serve others, that might made right, that the strong naturally ruled the weak. Genesis challenged this fundamental assumption by declaring that every human bore the divine image, making each person a sacred being worthy of respect, protection, and opportunity for flourishing. This revolutionary idea took centuries to penetrate human consciousness and transform social structures. But its influence can be traced through the abolition of slavery, the extension of voting rights, the development of public education, and the ongoing struggle for justice across all societies. Modern environmental movements unknowingly echo Eden's mandate for humans to tend and keep creation, though they often miss the theological foundation that makes such stewardship meaningful. Genesis established that humans serve as God's representatives on earth, responsible for caring for creation rather than exploiting it. The Hebrew words abad and shema, to serve and to guard, suggest both cultivation and conservation, development and protection, use and preservation. When contemporary environmentalists argue for sustainable development, species protection, and responsible resource management, they invoke principles first articulated in Genesis, even when they reject its theological framework. The earth belongs ultimately to God. Humans serve as stewards rather than owners, and accountability for environmental care extends beyond immediate self-interest to cosmic responsibility. Climate change discussions increasingly reflect Genesis themes about human action affecting global systems. The flood narrative demonstrates that human behavior can trigger environmental consequences far beyond immediate intentions, while the Rainbow Covenant establishes divine commitment to Earth's stability despite human failures. Modern environmental ethics struggles with the same tension between human dominion and environmental preservation that Genesis addresses through the stewardship model. When geneticists completed mapping the human genome, they discovered what Genesis had declared millennia earlier. All humans share 99.9% identical DNA, confirming scientifically that racial variations represent superficial adaptations rather than fundamental species differences. The Human Genome Project validated the biblical claim that all humanity descended from common ancestors, that racial boundaries were essentially cosmetic, that the unity of the human family transcended apparent differences. This genetic evidence has profound implications for racial justice, immigration policy, and international relations. When science confirms that genetic diversity within racial groups exceeds genetic differences between racial groups, it becomes impossible to maintain scientific justification for racism, ethnic nationalism, or claims of genetic superiority. Genesis got it right. We are one human family, created in one divine image, sharing one common origin and destiny. Bioethicists wrestling with genetic engineering, human cloning, artificial intelligence, and life extension technologies find themselves returning repeatedly to Genesis questions. What makes humans unique among Earth's creatures? What are the appropriate limits of human creativity and technological manipulation? How do we balance the capacity to heal with the wisdom to accept natural limitations? The creation account suggests that humans share with God the capacity for creativity, decision-making, and moral responsibility, but it also establishes boundaries symbolized by the forbidden tree beyond which human knowledge becomes dangerous. Contemporary debates about designer babies, artificial consciousness, and radical life extension echo Eden's tension between the gift of knowledge and the wisdom to use it appropriately. Marriage laws across cultures reflect Genesis principles that have shaped human understanding of prose. Family structure for millennia, the leave and cleave pattern. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Establish the nuclear family as the basic unit of human society, distinct from but connected to extended family networks. Even as marriage definitions evolve in various societies, the underlying Genesis principle persists: committed partnership between equals who create new family units while maintaining connections to larger kinship networks. The emphasis on exclusive commitment, mutual responsibility, and the creation of new households continues to influence legal frameworks, economic systems, and social expectations across cultures. Weekly rest cycles throughout global civilization honor the Sabbath pattern embedded in creation's rhythm, though most practitioners rarely connect their weekend breaks to Genesis theology. The 7-day week appears across cultures that had no contact with Hebrew traditions, suggesting either universal human recognition of natural rhythms or the persistence of common ancient memory. Modern research on circadian rhythms, workplace productivity, and mental health consistently validates the wisdom of regular rest cycles. Societies that ignore Sabbath principles through continuous work schedules, 24/7 availability expectations, or elimination of communal rest periods discover increased rates of burnout, family breakdown, and social dysfunction. In physics, the Big Bang Theory parallels Genesis's description of reality, erupting from nothingness through divine command. Let there be light resonates with contemporary cosmology's account of the universe, beginning as pure energy, expanding from an infinitesimal point, creating space, time, matter, and the physical laws that govern cosmic development. Fine-tuning arguments in cosmology suggest a universe precisely calibrated for life, with fundamental constants adjusted to values that allow for stellar formation, planetary systems, chemical complexity, and biological development. The mathematical precision required for a life-supporting universe echoes Genesis themes about intentional design, purposeful creation, and cosmic hospitality for conscious beings. Quantum mechanics reveals strange parallels to Genesis's emphasis on the power of observation and word. The observer effect in quantum physics suggests that conscious observation affects physical reality, while the measurement problem indicates that waves of possibility collapse into definite states only when observed. These discoveries resonate with Genesis's emphasis on divine word creating reality and human consciousness, bearing special significance in cosmic order. Archaeological excavations continue unearthing evidence that supports Genesis's historical framework. Discoveries at sites throughout the Near East confirm the existence of sophisticated civilizations during the periods when Genesis places. Patriarchal narratives. Trade routes match patriarchal journeys, legal customs explain puzzling Genesis stories, and cultural practices illuminate ancient behaviors that seemed arbitrary to earlier interpreters. Recent discoveries include evidence of massive flooding events in Mesopotamia during periods corresponding to traditional dating of Noah's flood, sophisticated astronomical knowledge among ancient peoples that matches Genesis's emphasis on celestial bodies marking time, and rapid development of agricultural and technological innovations following periods of apparent cultural disruption. The Joseph story provides templates for economic planning that modern governments study when preparing for cyclical disasters. Joseph's strategy of storing 20% of production during abundant years to survive 7 years of famine offers principles that apply to natural disaster, preparation, economic recession planning, and resource management for sustainable development. Contemporary emergency management agencies employ similar strategies, building strategic reserves during prosperous periods, developing distribution systems that can function during crises, maintaining international cooperation that allows resource sharing during regional disasters, and training administrative personnel who can implement complex logistical operations under pressure. As humanity reaches toward Mars exploration, artificial intelligence development, and genetic manipulation at the molecular level, Genesis whispers ancient warnings about the Tower of Babel, reminding modern innovators that technical capability without spiritual wisdom leads to catastrophe. The Babel narrative suggests that human collaboration can achieve remarkable technological feats, but that such achievements become dangerous when motivated by pride rather than service, self-glorification rather than stewardship. Space exploration raises Genesis questions about human dominion extending beyond Earth, while artificial intelligence development challenges assumptions about consciousness, creativity, and the unique qualities that distinguish humans from other created beings. Genetic engineering capabilities force decisions about the appropriate limits of human intervention in natural processes that God established during Creation Week. Yet Genesis also encourages bold creativity, presenting humans as partners with God in cultivating and developing creation's potential. The mandate to fill the earth and subdue it suggests that exploration, innovation, and technological development fulfill rather than violate divine purposes, provided they serve creation's flourishing rather than human pride. Whether gazing through the Hubble Space Telescope at cosmic birth 14 billion years ago, or examining through electron microscopes the molecular machinery that powers cellular life, 21st century explorers find Genesis themes increasingly relevant rather than obsolete. Ancient wisdom illuminates contemporary questions about human origin, purpose, and destiny as our species writes new chapters in the ongoing story of creation. Climate scientists studying global warming find parallels to the flood narrative's warnings about human action triggering environmental consequences beyond human control. Epidemiologists tracking pandemic diseases recognize patterns similar to the plagues that Genesis describes, affecting ancient populations. Social scientists analyzing political polarization and cultural breakdown see reflections of the chaos that preceded both the flood and the Tower of Babel dispersal. Yet Genesis offers hope alongside warning. The Rainbow Covenant promises environmental stability despite human failures. The call of Abraham demonstrates that divine purposes continue working through human obedience, even when civilizations collapse. The story of Joseph reveals that apparent setbacks can become foundations for greater blessing when trust in divine sovereignty persists through difficult circumstances. Genetic therapies promise to heal diseases that have plagued humanity since the fall. Space exploration may provide refuge from earthly catastrophes, while extending human presence throughout the universe. Artificial intelligence might amplify human creativity and problem-solving capacity beyond current imagination. Each technological advancement echoes Genesis themes about human capacity to participate in ongoing creation. The text that began with light conquering darkness continues illuminating paths forward, as humanity faces choices that will determine whether our growing power serves creation's flourishing or hastens its destruction. Ancient stories about gardens and floods, promises and covenants, dreams and interpretations provide templates for navigating contemporary challenges with wisdom rather than mere cleverness. Genesis remains remarkably contemporary precisely because it addresses perennial human questions that transcend cultural boundaries and historical periods. Who are we? Where did we come from? Why are we here? What is our purpose? How should we relate to each other, to the natural world, to the divine source from which all existence flows? The book that opened with, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," continues opening new beginnings for each generation, willing to discover its relevance for their unique challenges and opportunities. From Mesopotamian ziggurats to space stations, from Eden's trees to genetic trees, from Noah's Ark to space arcs, the story continues, ancient wisdom guiding future possibilities, eternal principles addressing temporal problems, divine purposes working through human choices. The beginning was just the beginning. The best is yet to come.